Hello, everyone. I'm Lisa Bowling. I'm the interim director of the RAD-SCC and host for the ASL Lecture series. We welcome Thomas Holcomb here today for his presentation to you all. I want to say a few things. I came in '89, and Tom's office was on the first floor in Tower A at Ellingson Hall. A lot of faculty staff worked there. When I came in 1992, I saw Tom as a new employee, and he worked there. That's how I knew Tom from way back when. Tom's family is generationally deaf. His parents are deaf, his grandparents are deaf, and he has deaf children and deaf grandchildren as well. One is hard of hearing and the other is hearing. Am I right, Tom? Did I get that right? When he worked with the SLT, he went to the University of Rochester to study for his PhD in education. He got his degree and decided to move back to his home state of California. He works as a professor there at Ohlone College. It's in Fremont, California. He teaches deaf education and as well as interpreting. Thomas will come up and share a little bit more about himself and his life, and then he'll expand upon the deaf-centered interpreting, the topic for our ASL lecture series today. So please give a warm welcome to Dr. Tom Holcomb.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be here. Even though I've moved back to California, you know, my heart was in San Francisco, but my heart also still remains in Rochester, and it feels so good to be back. Some fantastic people here. This is a great place. NTID, RIT, nothing beats it. I know sometimes you can complain about what's happening, but this is a great place. I have no regrets for leaving. You know, I remember that cold white stuff that came from the sky, and that was an annual event, and being from California, that was really difficult to handle. I didn't handle it well, to say the least, but I still love this place. So I'm going to be talking about deaf-centered interpreting. You may be wondering what that means, but before I talk about that, I want to explain my journey on how I got to this place, my background. And I'm sure that many of you in the audience who are deaf can relate to that. And there are some experiences that I had that are quite painful, and I'll have to open up and share those with you. And that's my story. You know, being in a deaf world and coming to a hearing environment presents challenges. So as a deaf person and being in a deaf environment, you know, that's one thing, but coming into a hearing environment and, you know, not having my colleagues being a solo deaf person presents many, many challenges. And so I'm going to be talking about how I've worked with interpreters over the years and, you know, how I've not been very satisfied and what we can do to make it much, much better. And my work tells me that no, that we have to consider some changes. What those changes are, that's up for discussion. But, you know, hearing people, or hearing interpreters say, well, what do you want from me? And they say, well, I want clear signing. Well, what does that mean? You know, what am I to do to beat that request? But I know that, you know, we know there are some good interpreters, some bad interpreters, and we talk about that, but never do we get to the level of why. And so I've immersed myself into looking at that question. What is the needs here? Well, how can we make things better? There are some times when you have challenging experiences, other times there are very satisfactory experiences. But with all my experiences, I'm at a point now where I don't know why or what I'm having issues, even though I've worked with some interpreters who are my friends, and they do really good work with me, and when I work with those interpreters, it just is fantastic. But sometimes there are interpreters who say, well, listen, we can't be friends. I have to maintain my professional distance. But I think, well, we can't be friends. You know, you get professional training, but the reality of the deaf culture is very different than those professional boundaries. So let me share my personal journey. This is not an ego trip for me to tell you about who I am and what I've done, but I just want to tell you how I got to this point. Then after that, I will share some potential solutions on what we can include as far as trying to resolve some of the challenges with working with interpreters. Many of us as deaf people have had these experiences. We want to look at making the interpreting field much, much better. For example, an interpreter comes up on stage and starts interpreting the spoken message. And the deaf person is there trying to access the information, but decides that, well, this is not meeting my needs, and has distractions that they can attend to while the interpreter continues to interpret nonstop. It sort of parallels my teaching. When I tell my students, you know, this class might be boring if you as a student do not work with me. It's going to be 16 weeks of boredom, and I'll be doing my show up here in the front of the classroom, but I need to have some interaction. And if that's the case, that's going to be effective. But if you're working with an interpreter who is working hard to interpret, but if the interpreter does something that causes the deaf person to be disengaged with the message, then the answer is something, yes, but we need to focus on that. We need to think about making interpreting more deaf-centered. So I'm going to share my experiences and tell you where I'm at. Are we ready for this? You know, and I'm a Gallaudet boy. And I remember coming to RIT, you know, and said, well, there's microbiology, there's microelectronics. You know, I found out these different tech majors here on campus, and never did I understand it, you know. Even my roommate was a biomedical photography major. I said, biomedical, what the? You know, and we take cadavers and we take pictures of organs and human body parts. And I thought, what? Wow. But this place is amazing. But for me, kind of felt out of it because I'm not technically astute. My focus for many years has been on writing about deaf culture. This was my second book that I wrote, and I'm very proud of some of my books. This is the second edition. And this is the old book that we wrote. This was in 2023, this is back in 2011. This is more comical, and this is more academic focused. And I've worked internationally as well. I've had opportunities to engage people on a global level on what deaf culture means. And so not just globally, but even locally. So that's been the joy of my work. And this all started here at NTID in my work with, you know, focusing on researching deaf culture, because this is an amazing place. I worked with the Student Life team years ago, and what my primary responsibility was to try to resolve deaf hearing issues on campus. My gosh, what an ongoing task. They would say, well, you're deaf persons, you people are rude. And the hearing students would say, well, deaf people are rude. Coming from Gallaudet, you know, a deaf space is very different. Here at RIT, NTID, they say, well, you know, this is a special place. Tower A, Tower B, Tower C, that's the deaf space. But hearing students didn't see it that way. There was a lot of friction that resulted. I mean, one of my favorite stories, if I can share, I was working with these students on a floor, and there was accusations of people being rude. The deaf student was accused of making too much noise, turning the music loud, and the deaf person says, well, I closed my door, you shouldn't be able to hear it. What's the problem? And so the deaf student thought, well, by closing the door, the sound wouldn't transfer over to other people's rooms, but the hearing student could hear the music despite the door being closed. And so that was something that I learned. It wasn't intentional, it was just different perspectives, the deaf and hearing perspective. Another story, one time a hearing person says, when you're in the shower, you make all this noise and it just bothers me, it sounds terrible. You know, and the guy, well, I'm in the shower doing, oh, oops. You're hearing that? Oh. And it's, blowing their nose, having their snot come out, and the hearing students can hear that. I said, that's disgusting. He said, well, I closed the shower curtain. You shouldn't be able to hear it, I kept it to myself. It shouldn't be a problem. Well, it was a problem for the hearing student. Just fascinating back when I was working there. So those experiences helped me to look at culture. It's not just about lighting and how you arrange the space. I mean, that's all part of it, but there's a lot more to it. It's much richer than that. How we think, how we breathe, how we act. And I'm grateful for the time I spent here at RIT and NTID, because that was the start of my journey in looking at deaf culture and hearing culture. And so I call this a lab to pursue that type of work. Now, when we talk about culture, there's multiple definitions, but this is my preferred way of explaining what culture refers to. Access to historical spaces. You can talk about, well, it's attire, it's the way you speak, it's the food, the cuisine, but it's also the environment. It's the individuals. And deaf culture is, how we survive, how we live, all that entails. It's solutions that we have to deal with to make our lives more meaningful. And so we, as deaf people, know how to come up with these solutions. You come to a space, you come to a place, you learn how to deal with it and come up with solutions, and you live, right? And this is a beautiful place. Whether you talk about NTID, Gallaudet, that's all part of the culture. And so with working with interpreters, we deal with a lot of challenges, a lot of issues. So what is the solution to some of these challenges? That's what I'm going to talk about today. Again, this has been my journey. It all started, I'm from a deaf family. We didn't need interpreters in our family. We had communication naturally. We moved from Indiana initially, then we moved to California in 1968. And that was during the rubella bubble. And so the schools were quite populated because we had so many deaf students. The School for the Deaf was full, so I was forced to be mainstream. And it was an oral program. And that was a terrible time for me. I was language deprived. Other students were language deprived because they didn't come from deaf families. And I remember them using Signing Exact English, SEE. And that was just an acceptable form of signing, so that was a big step. But we had an interpreter who was a C interpreter, and they had a family member who was deaf, and so they were an interpreter. And having this interpreter, it was a grandmother. It was a wonderful experience for me. And they signed all the initialized signs. It's going to be a beautiful day using all the initialized signs, and that was a wonderful experience. But because of this interpreter, this grandmother, my first experience was very positive. They were so grandmotherly to me. It made me so comfortable. And other students were willing to learn sign language as well, and there was a lot of interaction in the classroom. But at least everyone could figure spell, others could sign, I had friends, and so it was a beautiful place. I considered a home back in '68. Then I went to middle school, and there it was a terrible experience where I had to go to different classes. I wasn't in the same classroom all day long, so I had to traverse very different experiences in different classrooms. The grandmother that I had as an interpreter had to move away. And so I thought, no, I don't want to go there. So instead I went to MSSD and then Gallaudet, and that was a wonderful experience. And then I arrived to NTID, RIT. Now let me explain to you that I graduated from RIT with my career human development master's degree. And I remember looking at the various programs I had here, and I thought, well, which one's going to fit me? No, not these technical programs. Well, yeah, the career, okay, I'm a career, the human development, that fits me. And so I graduated with that master's degree, and I'm very proud. I'm a very proud graduate of RIT. But I had to use interpreters during that time. Sometimes I had a classmate who was deaf, other times I was the only deaf person in the classroom. Now, when I had a deaf classmate, that was a much better experience. So using interpreters back here at RIT, it all depended on the situation. It wasn't great all times. And I remember working at the student life team and dealing with the deaf hearing issues, going to different floors. And I had to deal with these young students who just graduated from high school and working with interpreters who were relatively new and working with them, trying to read the best I could of what they were trying to communicate with me and their style of interpreting. There were times when I had these professional meetings. Who was here back in the time, 82 to 91? Listen, I love you all. Remember the good old days? Many memories. My boss, if you'll remember, was Ellie Rosenfield. Beautiful Ellie. Ellie was a mentor to me. She was tough. Like during professional meetings, if we had an interpreter who was not interpreting accurately, Ellie made sure that she stepped up to ensure that there was access to communication. And I'm indebted to Ellie, but the interpreters hated her. Ellie did not care, said that the work that we're doing here is really important. If your reputation is more important as a deaf person than the interpreter's ego. There were other times when we had meetings and we didn't have an interpreter. And we realized that with the interpreting office, some of them would not take some of the assignments that I was assigned to. So as a deaf professional, I had to put up with that. That was times when I actually had to suffer as a result. But Ellie taught me that the most important thing is the deaf person's, the deaf professional's reputation. And we need to make sure that that's always in mind. Then I went on to U of R, and that was a really complicated situation, but luckily I had Pat DeCaro as my interpreter. Very fortunate. And I was there with Judy Coriel. Back in the day, we were colleagues, or we were students. And it was so nice that I had Judy there as a friend, and I had Pat as my interpreter. That was a nice setup. That was very different than the experience that I had at RIT, where I worked with various interpreters. Not being critical of RIT, but having a friend as an interpreter, a professional, versus working with a stranger, those are very different experiences for me. And so eventually I graduated with my PhD, and then I decided to move on, and I moved out and worked at San Jose University, and I worked at a very large university, 40,000 students enrolled. That was a cultural shock for me. I was here at RIT, a very small environment. And here I got really good evaluations because I was doing some good work. But there I had a designated interpreter, and I was very fortunate to work with this one interpreter day in, day out. That was very helpful. I spent 2 years there, and then Ohlone College offered me a position. Ohlone College is a mini NTID, meaning we have a large deaf program. We have 150 deaf students. You think about other programs, there's maybe 10, 20, Gallaudet's a large program, so Ohlone has programs for the deaf. So it's a mini NTID, as I said. We have our own dean who's deaf, plus we support our mainstream students, we have programs for deaf students. And so being there, I felt much better. The interpreter programs professors, I had to work with them, we were on the same floor. And they said, would you like to teach interpreting? And I thought, teach interpreting? And I thought, well, I can teach interpreting for an hour, teach an entire semester? I didn't think I had really anything to offer, but they continued to pursue me and ask me, please consider this opportunity. And I thought, well, I'll go ahead and try it because this is all new to me. And now I've moved on to becoming the chair of the department. And we've made a name change. It's now our culture change. It's a deaf-centered interpreting perspective, where the priority is working with the deaf person, not having it focus so much on the interpreters. You know that interpreting work is not easy. And sometimes, you have to think about the work Sometimes the work demands are not realistic. You think, what are some of the challenges? What are the reasons that we have these barriers? So I'm looking to change things so it's more deaf-centered. And here's an interesting thing. I have a second wife, and my wife is hearing. And that's been really interesting. My wife has taught me a tremendous amount. Has taught me about interpreting. All of our neighbors are hearing, and a lot of our friends are hearing, and so my wife often has to serve as an interpreter, and her friends as well. And sometimes there are challenging situations that are awkward. People will, sim-com, sign and speak at the same time. And when she's interpreting, she'll say, Tom said, and then she'll talk, say her own piece. And so I think about that experience and how it applies to my work. Hearing interpreters will often say, well, who said, I said that. People question, who's talking? Who in the audience is talking? Even work people say, well, Tom's saying, Tom said this. So they'll add that piece to it, that Tom is saying this. So it's clear on who's saying, so that my presence is important. I'm known as speaking, so I'm married to a hearing wife, and that experience has taught me a tremendous amount about how we can make interpreting more deaf-centered. And that's important to my wife, that I am seen as an equal, on par, not lesser than. So as a person, as a deaf person, we often find ourselves living in a survival mode, period. Every day it's a survival mode. We're a fish out of water. We try to make improvements and work hard on making communication accessible, but it is a challenge, and it is a huge challenge, and it's no fun, believe me. So in elementary school, I had that grandmother interpreter who helped me so much. Eternally grateful for that person. And then I had the graduate school experience where I had to try to demonstrate my academic knowledge, dealing with academic discourse. And sometimes I would see the interpreters just, moving their lips and looking at what they're saying, and it wouldn't make any sense. I'd have to check with my colleagues and say, are you understanding what's being said here? And they would say, no, I'm with you. And I thought maybe it was just me. I'm the dumb person. Everyone else was getting it. But Judy would say, no, it's not you. What they're presenting is not intelligent. They're trying to demonstrate their knowledge by using these 50-cent terms, but I need to be engaged. So I was in survival mode back in those days. And then even with my employment, my work, I wanted to achieve tenure, to get promotions. I had to sell myself. This was a university. I couldn't just stay back and, hope that promotion is going to happen without my being an active agent in it. So, you all know that. You work in a university environment, how important that is, that you are an active participant, that you are engaged in the academic world versus sitting back and hoping that, just time will fly and you'll be able to move on. You can't do that in an academic environment. So as a result, I had to survive. And then being married is also challenging. So I'm in a survival mode. Please don't share that with my wife. We have a lot of hearing friends, and sometimes it's a bit of a challenge of being engaged with our neighbors and our friends. So having a deaf wife was very different than being married to a hearing person. It's a very different dynamic, but that comes with the price of marrying a hearing person. My point here is, many interpreters don't really understand this fully. They come and they do their work and they feel good about their interpreting, but we are having to survive. We're grateful for the interpreters who do the work, but still there are challenges. From working with interpreters who challenge me, I've done a lot of research, a lot of digging into what are some of the issues. Here's my intercultural reading between the signs book that I wrote some years ago. So I helped co-author this, and then I'm the editor of this book. I edited 20 chapters. I got some pieces from 30 different deaf professionals across the spectrum. worked with a lot of deaf professionals and learned a lot from different deaf professionals, and I realized there's a lot of wisdom out there that I was not aware of. So we did a lot of collaborating, a lot of developing new ideas, and so I took bits and pieces from these 30 different professionals all across the US. Keith was part of that cohort, and we wrote this book. It's a sharing of this wisdom. It's the best way to survive when working with interpreters and interpreting environments. And this, online curriculum that I developed that helps hearing students learn information on ASL and interpreting. This is sort of a basic book, and then we have a more advanced book, and then the Sign of Respect 3 is more focused for interpreters, learning about various situations. I had to ask, surveyed 100 deaf professionals on what you think is the best solution for some of the challenges. It's like the Family Feud game show where they surveyed 100 people to get the answers. And last night we had a hearing. Some interpreting students attended the presentation, and the interpreters were there. And the scenario we're talking about, a signer, and they were watching a clip, and there was a different A, B, and C scenarios that what would be the best solution to a predicament involving an interpreter who was challenged. There was A, B, and there was like C. The interpreter who was not that skilled would ask what to do. The choices were, do I just wing it? Do I ask the deaf person what to do? Or do I ask my team interpreter? So there were like these 5 interpreters who were student interpreters who, did not really know how to respond, and so they chose the answer that they thought only 5% of the deaf community would respond in likewise, in a like fashion. So that was a good example, again, where 5% of deaf people responded this way, but the interpreters responded in that same fashion. So the question is, what is going on with interpreter training?
Okay, so let's talk about some solutions. Let's get to the meat of this, right? You know who I am. I've shared with you my background. Now, right? Can many of you here in the audience admit that you've been disengaged in interpreted situations? You've had to endure interpreted situations? It's been difficult, right? You're ready to go for the first 5 minutes, and after that, you can feel yourself slipping away. You can feel yourself disengaging, just biding your time, right? Talking to your friends in class, thinking about other things, right? You're just not engaged anymore. Suppose you're presenting, and the only thing you can do is just hope that the interpreter is representing you accurately, right? Oftentimes we're told, trust the interpreter. You have to trust the interpreter. But how do you trust an interpreter? It's almost impossible, especially as a faculty member presenting academic information, right? And if I'm grading material and the student's getting their information from an inaccurate interpretation, one classic example in my classroom was I absolutely disallowed the use of the word institution. Right? Because when hearing people hear the word institution, they think of an insane asylum, or for wayward youth, or, RIT is an institution. Uh-oh, right? No, I'm kidding. But I did not want that word utilized in a class about deaf education. And so we had an interpreter for the first few weeks, and then after that they switched. And I was talking about schools for the deaf throughout my teachings. And after the first exam, I graded the exams, and I had a student come to me and said, why did you grade this wrong? This was the information we got. And I didn't know that the interpreter was using the word that I didn't want used, right? So to just stand back and hope that the interpreter's understanding me and representing me accurately, is that the best we can do? Can we do anything different? Oh, poor interpreters, right? The interpreters feel like, really? I tried, I'm working as hard as I can, and here you are still criticizing my work. What am I supposed to do? I'm tired, this is hard, right? That's a very common response. And so as a deaf community, we relegate ourselves to realizing that that's what we have to put up with. And then if I ran the zoo, right? If I ran the world, whew, it would be a much, much better experience. Now, there's no way to attain perfection, but if we can work together to fix things and do it a better way, let's go for it. Honestly, ASL to spoken English is almost an impossible task. It's really difficult. Are deaf people sensitive to the challenges that interpreters face? I don't think so. Right? I've never seen an interpreter leave crying. I don't know what they do once they leave the room. I have really no idea, right? You know, I find out after the fact often that an interpreter was really upset. Maybe they didn't do a good job, but I have no idea how they feel when they're leaving because I present my information, I hope for the best, and then that's it. There's a disconnect between the interpreter's experience, that they're trying their best, all of the efforts they employ, and the deaf way, the cultural normative way of presenting an ASL. We're not connecting. We don't know what's happening for one another. So it's almost an impossible task that they're facing. So, right, I've worked with the interpreters that we have here today. We've had prep, we've had meetings, but oftentimes that's not the norm. I'm ready to present at a conference and I've got an interpreter there I have to work with who I've never met before, or video relay interpreters. The unknown interpreter appears on the screen to interpret my call. And as community members, we can say that many of them don't have good skills. I remember I had interpreting students go observe and they would come back and say, oh gosh, the interpreters are so bad, I can't believe it. And I would say, you know what, when you graduate and work in VRS, you're probably going to be lousy too. So what do we do about this? Because this is almost an impossible task that they're facing. So I believe it's up to the deaf consumers, our deaf community members, to take some ownership and responsibility and become more aware. We have to work with our interpreters, right? Oftentimes we'll say, you know, just do your job. You know how to do your job. You do your job, I'll do mine. Now, that's probably less likely if we take that approach that we're going to have a good experience, right? We may not expect anything different because we're used to enduring unsatisfactory experiences. I value my integrity and the integrity of my work. I'm so thankful and grateful to Ellie Rosenfield that she prioritized my work as a deaf person, that she prioritized my communication over that of the needs and the feelings of the interpreter. So we're told to trust, but it's very difficult to present and try to lip read an interpreter when they're working into spoken English. So the solution you'll see here in the room is to have another interpreter. And so instead of me trying to lip read the working interpreter, I'm able to readily glance over to the second interpreter, the third one in this case, and see exactly what the interpreter is saying. And then another backup beyond that is the captioning immediately to her right that I can see. So I know what the working interpreter is saying. And I can see if the interpreter is saying something that I don't mean to be said, that I didn't intend to be said in a particular way. But if I'm just signing and I have no way to verify the accuracy, then I have no way to verify it, right? I want to have some control over my work. I don't know these two interpreters who are working with us today. When I fly to conferences, I don't know the interpreters who show up there to work with me either. Here at NTID, of course, we know we have many skilled interpreters. And I'm grateful for that. And I'm grateful to have a full team here working with me. This is a dream situation. But in a mainstream classroom, you can't have 3 or 4 working interpreters, and I do feel for the interpreter who's signing back to me. Right, so I'm able to see what's going on, what's being communicated. I can tell if the interpreter is representing me accurately. I can tell if I'm signing too fast and the interpreter's working quickly to catch up. And so I can adjust and modify the pace of my presentation. I'd much rather have that kind of verification than have no idea what's going on in the representation of my work. So I'm going to ask the third interpreter to stop signing at this point. And I'd like to model what it could look like if there were just 2 assigned interpreters to a presentation. So normally we have 2 interpreters signed. The second interpreter is not actively working into spoken English. The second interpreter can become the back channel interpreter, signing to me what the working interpreter is saying. And so that way I can have some verification of what is represented to me in spoken English. So I can look at that interpreter readily as I present. Now, normally, traditionally, the role of a team interpreter is to support the working interpreter. I'm asking the second team interpreter to support me and work as a team, put their attention on me. So there may be times when the working interpreter may not like that. That may not be their preferred method, because the working interpreter may feel like they need that team interpreter. They may feel left out on their own. But what's more important? Prioritizing the deaf speaker and their needs, or the interpreter? So thank you for modeling that for us. And we'll turn it back over to Nick, our third interpreter. I work with what I call a designated ally. My designated ally for today's presentation is Lynn Fenton. If you could stand, Lynn, please. Lynn knows my work very well. Many times my designated ally in the past, it would have been Ellie in years past. Sometimes it's colleagues. And if I don't introduce this person as such, then the interpreter can be taken aback when my designated ally may speak up. I call it a no surprise policy. I invite my designated ally to the pre-meeting. I explain what their role is and what the expectation is. I trust my ally more than I trust the working interpreters, and I apologize to them, but I trust the person that I know and who knows me. And if something doesn't sound right to my designated ally, if the message is inaccurate, if either one of the working interpreters are not representing me properly, then they know they can step in. And they can step in any way that we've agreed to. They can take over and take the mic. They can correct the interpreters by just adding a sentence or a word, or they can let me know. So we are working cohesively as a team with a no surprise policy. So I was teasing Lynn. I thought, gosh, Lynn, if something goes wrong, how are you going to know? And Lynn said, well, I'm going to get a running start and I'm going to dive nose first onto the stage. And we were having the most fun figuring out how she was going to do that. Today we have a third interpreter signing back to me. I've got captioning as a backup, and I have a designated ally. And with all of that, I feel safe. I'm able to focus solely on my presentation, and we deserve that. In mainstream classes, it may be a little more difficult, but for some of you who are professionals, academics, I suggest that you find your designated allies amongst your colleagues. I suggest you try working in this manner. Because if you happen to have interpreters who are really misrepresenting you and skewing the message, I've worked with interpreters who haven't had the necessary skill or the prep. They may not be familiar with my topic. They may be tired. It could be a myriad of reasons why things have gone wrong. I would expect my ally, Lynn, in this case, to absolutely take over, right? And in whatever way possible, interrupt the interpreters, ask for the microphone, and take over, right? Kindly, gently, without being overtly offensive, but take over. I learned that from Dr. Larry Fleischer. Some of you may be familiar with Larry Fleischer from CSUN. I attended nationwide conferences frequently, large panel discussions, thank you. And Larry always had a colleague with them, Joyce Good. And Larry would say, anytime I'm going to be presenting or participating, Joyce is going to be speaking for me into spoken English. And that was just the norm. And the interpreters were asked to not interpret any time Larry presented or participated, right? Because it's very difficult if you're working with interpreters you're not familiar with. Some of them are good, some you can lip read easily. But Larry didn't have to worry because he had a solution in place And that's what worked. More power to him. So find your colleagues, find the people who can be your designated allies right here amongst your campus partners, right? Protect your academic reputation, your integrity, your professional reputation. And again, own your words. Start by saying, Tom speaking. This is Keith speaking. This is Jackie speaking, right? So that the people who may be unfamiliar working with interpreters know that the words are coming from you. Many working interpreters are females, and so when I begin any phrase with Tom speaking, even though someone may hear a female voice, we have to continually remind them that the message is coming from me, Tom. Own your words. Now, the majority of work that interpreters do is working from spoken English into ASL. So there are some considerations. Work with your deaf consumers, right? Many times interpreters will ask deaf consumers if they have a particular preference, sign English or ASL, but most deaf consumers don't have a preference, just sign clearly. Whatever you do is typically fine for them. That's their expectation. They may not even know they have options, and so it feels like a silly question. Then consider, and this was a wonderful experience, real time here, I was able to look at the interpreter, recognize that the working interpreter was catching up as she was processing the message. And it makes the working interpreter's lives a little bit easier because it allowed me to know that I had to pause for just a moment. And you could see it happening real time here. That's working together. So oftentimes I ask interpreters, who are you interpreting for? And they say, well, the deaf people. But if you consider, are RIT students, deaf students here, different than deaf people in the community? Right? How many people are bilingual? Your average grassroots deaf person, does an interpreter have the ability to use a language that accommodates any deaf person on the spectrum of language use? So here at RIT, you have some deaf people who are absolutely balanced bilinguals, able to receive and utilize any language that comes at them. You have others that have a more preferred mode, be it ASL or more signed English. And interpreters have to be able to linguistically accommodate the deaf person that they're interpreting for. Because there are some deaf people who are not signers. They prefer signed English. Maybe they prefer something more auditorily based. So we can't simply say the deaf and think that that's a one-size-fits-all, right? Because what you learn here at RIT and the community that you interact with here at RIT may be very different than the community they interact with in the real world, right? So interpreters have to be ready to accommodate someone that may be language deprived or someone from the vast variety of language use. So I remind you here at RIT, don't forget that most deaf people are not like your RIT students here. So you have the best of the most brilliant and brightest skilled and capable students here, students, faculty, and staff in the world. Okay, English discourse and ASL discourse are vastly different, and we can study the two and be very well versed. But when it comes time to put it into real action, interpreters typically default to which discourse? They typically default to the English auditory discourse. Why is it they can't default to the ASL discourse structure? Well, one of the reasons is it's difficult. That's why we say they default to it, because it's easier. English discourse may use a number of vocabulary and be very verbose and have a lot of implicit meaning. It may be presented at a very fast pace. We're all familiar with speakers who simply read from a paper, right? And they simply stand there and read 100 words a minute, right? It even feels weird to try to do it and replicate it. There are some signers who have done it too, right? And sometimes people will check in with the interpreter and say, am I talking too fast? And interpreters, to be accommodating, say, no, no, you're fine. And they go right back to it. But what I see as a deaf person is simply a blur of signs. No one's asking me if I'm comprehending the message. And many times what I see from where I sit is that the two interpreters applaud one another of doing such a good job. But no one's asking me, the deaf person, right? They're applauding one another, they're making each other feel very good and positive about their work. But I leave having really gained nothing from being present in that interaction. It's different now, right? There are presenters who are really good at presenting and they engage the audience. But ASL and that's unusual for English discourse. ASL discourse is very interactive. I love Keith Cagle and Patrick Graybill and many others in the audience who wait and expect for the back channeling that is present in American Sign Language, right? But with hearing presenters, there's that blank-faced, no really effective feedback. They are very different discourse styles, and interpreters default to English discourse style, which oftentimes results in a deaf person feeling left out and disengaged. It's very different if you have a presentation that's presented in an engaging discourse. So English discourse can be very vague, can have implied meaning, where ASL discourse is very overt. It makes its points clear. Oftentimes, deaf people in the audience will check in with one another to clarify what the vague meaning might be. So again, the discourse styles are different, and the level of engagement in each discourse style is very different. So interpreters are in a difficult spot. Whether it's a workshop or a class or whatever it is, they may be presented with English discourse that's overwhelming to them. So what are the ways that we can use our cultural knowledge to come up with some solutions? So here are some ideas. I'm not saying that I've got all the answers. My goal is simply to begin the conversation together. Some of these may work in some situations and not in others, but let's begin the dialogue. Let's talk about ways that deaf people can become more engaged in their mainstream settings. Let's talk about ways that interpreters can more incorporate ASL discourse and deaf cultural norms. Let's work together. So, many times, norm in the field is interpreters will work in 20-minute shifts and they switch on and off. There's consecutive interpreting, there's simultaneous interpreting. Consecutive interpreting is less common, simultaneous interpreting is more common. Is there a way we can find a middle point? Maybe if the information is coming very quickly, much like the way a CDI will work, they may work with what we call main point interpreting. So they'll get rid of the fluff that's in the message and they'll simply present the salient points of the message. Some hearing interpreters know how to just present the main salient points. They're able to do that. That's what good note-taking is all about, right? It's about getting rid of the fluff and the extraneous, unnecessary information and keeping the main points. So maybe we can have interpreters begin to work with that main point interpreting. Don't make it a blur. Don't present a blur. Work toward comprehension, right? So interpreters need to filter that information. They need to be able to understand what the point is. And I would suggest to the interpreters that you work with the deaf people that you're working with, right? To say, this is what I'm trying to do. I want to pace this very fast discourse that's coming at me, and I want to make it main point interpreting, and I want to work with you to make sure you understand. Some deaf people may not want that. Right? Some deaf people may be comfortable and familiar with the presenter and understand that the pace will be very fast. But other deaf people may want the interpretation to be more accessible. So not every deaf person is going to make the same choice, and this is simply one possible idea to work together. Okay, so we are all very familiar, especially if you've got more than one deaf person in the audience, that we work together, right? It's a collectivist approach to communication, right? I got to talk to you later about this. I want to remember this point. This is a great interpreter. This is a great speaker. That's wonderful if we're together, but if you're the sole person in the audience working through an interpreted situation and the interpreter presents a zero affect, disengaged message to you, before you know it, you're going to be asleep. Now, why not work together? Why not become a team, right? So maybe an interpreter doesn't add their opinion, but simply adds some more of those ASL discourse engaging language structures to help engage the deaf person, right? Work together with the deaf person. Dance with the deaf person, so to speak, throughout your interpretation, right? Many times I'll look amongst my colleagues, if they're non-signers, they're simply taking notes and not even watching the presenter, right? So again, I ask the interpreters to be there for me, work with me, and take something that's an English discourse and try to modify it so that it's more effective and accessible for me. This is one of my favorite examples. You may be familiar with rhetorical questions, the who, what, why, how, and when. So interpreters sometimes present this in a very flat manner as a run-on sentence. And they're not engaging the rhetorical question feature. The point of the rhetorical question is to elicit a response, right? So typically, a rhetorical question by a deaf presenter will ask the rhetorical question, the who, or the how, or the what, and they'll wait for a visible response from the audience members. It's an actual visual response, a call and response. One of my favorite interpreters, who I was working with, in their interpretation presented a rhetorical why to me and kept saying it until the third time I realized, oh, they want a response from me, but I was disengaged. But this interpreter wouldn't let it go. They absolutely were waiting for a response from me before they proceeded. And that was helpful because it snapped me back awake and kept me engaged again. So interpreters need to learn those engaging features of ASL, right? It takes a millisecond, half of a millisecond, to have that sort of engagement with a deaf person by using a language feature that does so. We need that kind of interplay and flexibility in working together as a team. And then I've already talked about using confirmation as an approach to ensure understanding, or make a connection and build a rapport, right? It's validating. Just do something to make sure that you're engaged. So team interpreting, typically they work in 20-minute shifts. That's the norm in the field, and to that I say, I am jealous. I'd like that kind of attention. I'd like someone giving me their full attention for 20 minutes, as the team interpreters often do to one another. I'd really like one of them to give their full attention to me, right? And we say that research is the reason that we switch in 20-minute shifts, but that's difficult on a deaf person because the two interpreters may have vastly different signing styles. And when the one interpreter that I may not connect with as well or not as skilled as the other is up for their 20 minutes, I'm biding my time, right? So to me, it looks like the single sole hearing presenter has two different personalities, right? And so interpreters are often focused on one another, but I would say to them, what you're doing is more difficult to me. It's difficult for me to engage. So maybe switch when the speaker switches. So I ask that I be the focus of support for the team interpreter. Oftentimes, if you're in a very engaged, highly interactive environment, a team may split up where one interpreter works with the main speaker and the other interpreter interprets all of the other comments from the members, right? Instead of an interpreter saying, well, the person with the purple dress said this and the woman with the blonde hair said that, and then 20 minutes later another interpreter says it a different way. That's difficult. So again, this is context dependent because a 2-hour lecture may require the traditional 20-20 switch. But other environments may provide opportunities for something different. Now, I don't know. For me as a deaf person, I can say what feels better to me, but we have to work together to determine those solutions. You may have a team of interpreters who one works into spoken English for the entirety of the presentation and the other works into sign language, right? And they're ready to do that. They've agreed to take those two separate roles for the entirety of the presentation. That could be a possibility. You may have interpreters placed in opposite sides of the room, and one interprets for one side of the room and the other interprets for the other side of the room. Or maybe you've got an interpreter placed at different tables, if that's the setup in the room. Anything but that traditional 20-20 minute switch, because that's typically not effective for deaf people. And then the SSP, the Supportive Service Provider, right? This looks like in a training where you've got a manual and a binder, and the presenter's talking about page 3, line 7 on the third paragraph. And by the time you find that spot in the book or the manual as a deaf person, you've missed what the speaker has said about it. So maybe the team interpreter could be the one flipping the pages and pointing to paragraph 3 and highlighting the word in line 7. So I'm calling it a support service provider, but it's an opportunity for the team interpreter to work in a different way. And it may work or it may not. Okay, this is my last point. You have a campus of partners, right, who are non-signing hearing presenters, chair people, faculty members, right? And when they ask the interpreter, am I speaking too fast for you? And indeed they are. Interpreters, please stop accommodating. Stop saying it's okay and you're fine when you're not. Own up to the fact that you're not able to keep up. And can the presenter slow down? Let's talk about turn taking. Let's engage in turn taking so that everyone has an opportunity to engage and participate. And PowerPoint slides need to be constructed in a way that they're more accessible, right? Because hearing presenters will say, well, the next point and this one and that one, and those are nondescript in ASL. But if a PowerPoint can utilize A, B, and C, or numerically number the points, that's more readily accessible visually. So in my classroom at our college, we don't allow bullet points on our slides. It's either numerical or it's alphabetical so that the points can be referenced specifically. It's more easily accessible to everyone, not just the deaf people. Now, an interesting way that that became a college policy is that our college was talking about equity and access. And they erroneously thought that simply having an interpreter in their classroom was sufficient. But after conversation, we realized that there are other visual ways that we can make the information more accessible. And my final point, utilizing Canvas and videos on the Canvas, right? So when we all switched to Zoom and we were looking in computer screens and you had everyone with their cameras off, it was very difficult to know who was speaking and to be engaged. And so the request was simply, if you have a comment, turn your camera on, be seen for the entirety of your comment, and then turn your camera back off. And I wanted people to do it, but some of them wouldn't. And I just lied. I outright lied and said, you know, I really do need to lip read. It just makes it more accessible for me. I've got to lip read you. In order to do that, you have to turn your camera on, you know. But in reality, I wanted to connect with who the speaker was. Some participants in Zoom meetings simply wouldn't. And I got to the point where I said, you know, to the group, you're not making this an accessible or equitable or inclusive environment, and I'm leaving. I'm leaving the meeting, you know? And so in standing up for myself, what wasn't working eventually changed. So to bring this home, I'd like to say, let's work together. Let's create a deaf dream team, or what I call a DEAM. Let's figure out together what works for me. Let's have an understanding and a sensitivity to the challenges that interpreters face. And let's work together to make it a better experience for everyone. Let's stop enduring what doesn't work for us as deaf people and interpreters. I would like to thank you all for your time and engagement today. And again, this is just the beginning of what I hope is a long and rich conversation. We've got representatives from the interpreter education community here, the deaf community, and working interpreters and faculty. Thank you all for your time. Okay, I have an exciting announcement. I've got here on stage next to me our first deaf interpreter as a full-time staff member at Access Services at RIT. So welcome and thank you for being here. And I have to let you know that we are simply loaning her to you for a while until she comes back to California, because I expect her to come back home. My point being is she's a new staff member. I'm very excited that she's here. You might be a little bit nervous, right? I don't know. But you're going to do a wonderful job. This is a wonderful community, place to be. Question?
Where should I position myself? Stand over here? Okay. Well, Tom, thank you for your wonderful presentation. Very thought-provoking. It does make me think about a lot of our deaf students and deaf people don't understand the interpreting process until you actually experience it yourself. For example, having a CDI, knowing what the process of interpreting looks like or is involved. So as a deaf person, are there workshops, are there courses, required courses, training that we can learn more about the interpreting process to learn how difficult, how challenging it is? And I must admit, I always thought, well, interpreting, it's a piece of cake, it's an easy task. You know, and now as an interpreter training, I realize that it's much more difficult than I first thought. So what are your thoughts?
That's a great question, thank you. You know, many times there'll be workshops hosted about, you know, how to work with interpreters, and no one shows up. And you have to ask the question, why aren't people showing up? Right? You may have experienced it yourself. Right? I'm in that situation too. I want to move the work forward. I'm proud that two of my former students from Ohlone College are here. Please stand, Lourdes and Cassandra. When did you graduate, Lourdes? 2 years ago? 2022 and 2021, and now they're here at RIT NTID. But to your question and your point, I don't really have an answer. I mean, I teach in the program that our interpreters need to share the knowledge that they have with the consumers they work with. They can talk about the options that are possible, switching with the speaker or working different ways, and present those options to deaf students who may not know that they have options. Our deaf students may not have the opportunity to learn about how working interpreters work, so it's upon us to present those options to them, right? You've got over 1,000 deaf and hard of hearing students here. How much are we sharing the interpreting process or the captioning process or the options that are available to them to make it more effective and easy and deaf-centered?
And that's rare.
And that's rare that you have the environment that you have here. So take the time, talk to deaf students, right? Talk about this presentation today. Share with folks what you've learned from this presentation today, because you are all educators. The community of interpreters and deaf students and deaf people work together to educate one another. Deaf people may not realize how difficult the task of interpreting is.
My name is Margaret, talking. 2 questions for you, Tom. Let's talk about CDI. So my question with the CDI, should we remove C from CDI? Should we just call them deaf interpreters DI? We don't call certified interpreters, across the board for hearing interpreters. We just say they're an interpreter. So should we remove the C from the CDI? And also, I want to talk about giving feedback, and how you're able to engage the interpreters. But where is the boundary? Where's the, having interpreters who you work with in a personal way, but also, they may serve as your client, but sometimes we're crossing a line, and where is that line at? I want to ask you if you have any thoughts on that.
2 very valid points. So I'm not a CDI. I'm not a working interpreter. I'm a deaf-centered consumer with consumer experiences. So hats off to you, working interpreters, who need to have your own conversations, trainings, and conferences, and you need to be at the table together. I can't necessarily speak to that. I may have a personal opinion. There are many hearing interpreters who don't have certification, So to say all deaf interpreters are CDIs and we don't have any label for hearing interpreters, I think that it's an interesting question to pose to the community. But I don't consider myself a member of that community per se, so I don't want to answer for them. But I have a lot of respect for the work that they do. Secondly, speaking to boundaries and engagement, I think that's where the conversation happens, right? This is new. This is a new idea. And so it may be fodder for great conversation, right? And deaf people may not be interested in it, and others might be. And there are times when even my best friend having a conversation, I'm just disengaged. Maybe there are students that have greater privilege or others that don't, and so it's awkward and it's new, but I think the important part is to have the conversation, right? It can't be simply about drawing hard lines and refusing to bend and flex and work together. It's talking about how can we best manage the situation so that it's more effective for everyone. And I think that this is new. I'm seeing from your responses in the audience that this is new. So this is just planting a seed and beginning the conversation. And maybe 5 years from now, some of my solutions will be used and others will be replaced by better solutions.
Nice to meet you. I remember some time ago in my interpreting program, I read your book and I found it very informative. Now to see you in person, this is awesome. I'm from California, so yeah, that's fellow Californians. I'm from San Diego. I'm actually going there soon, but you just had a comment, and then it resonated with me, with interpreting, you must collaborate with our deaf consumers. It must be deaf-centered to ensure there's a level of engagement there. Whatever it takes, make sure that there's engagement. But there are certain situations where, and especially with first and second year students, I'll come into the classroom and I'll say, hey, how's it going? I want to try to strike up a conversation. And there's some reticence, some reluctance to have that conversation. And despite my best efforts, I hit a wall trying to make sure that there's that engagement. But whatever the comfort level may be or the boundary. So with that in mind, 2 questions. When are you doing too much? You cross the line despite your best efforts. You don't want to make that person uncomfortable, first and foremost. Secondly, let me expand on this. I know there are a lot of deaf seniors, juniors, who really are able to advocate on their own behalf, especially graduate students. They have that seasoning, if you will. For our younger students, they don't have that life experience. So how can we ensure that we send a message to these young deaf students that you need to take a more active role, try to educate them on how they can be part of the process. How the NTID community can make sure that we're conveying this message that these people have the power to be engaged and be part of the process.
Again, you have about 1,000 deaf and hard of hearing students here. That really says it all. Some of them haven't had any interaction like this before. Right? It's a cultural norm to be engaged as a deaf community, but right? How, as a hearing interpreter, do you become a member of the community? Do you go to deaf events, right? Do you stand there and smile awkwardly at people? Because then deaf people are going to think you're just weird, right? So follow the cultural norms of the community. When you see deaf people together in the cafeteria, have a seat at the table, join them. Don't feel like you're invading on their space. Don't just walk by waiting for an invitation, right? Just waiting for an invitation isn't going to work. It's awkward. They end up at a table by themselves with another hearing peer. They're trying to have a conversation, continually waiting, desperately waiting for that invitation. And it just looks weird. I have to be honest. The deaf people, the deaf students are gonna not want you at their table, And when someone lets you know you're weird, you're gonna feel even weirder. It's difficult, you know? If there's an available seat when you see deaf students together in the cafeteria, join them. 90% of the time, you're going to be welcome into the conversation. Maybe 5% of the time, there'll be some eye rolls and, you know, they wish you weren't there. And you may disagree. Just join the conversation. Invite yourself. Introduce yourself. Engage, make friends, have conversations. Be a part of the community. Right? Don't wait for an invitation. Don't be awkward about it. Be assertive, be friendly, be warm and welcoming. Right? And just like you're waiting for an invitation, maybe the deaf students are too. So if you're hosting a party or an event, then make sure you welcome the deaf students. Right? Don't wait for an invitation and don't withhold one. Because either way, you're going to be waiting for a long time. So either join the fun or welcome others into the fun, right? If it's a skiing trip, make sure folks know about it and make it inclusive, right? And don't just be the interpreter everywhere you go, right? Maybe you're an artist or a dancer or a skier or something else, and you've got some fun personal hobby or event going on. Invite people to go with you who are deaf. Enlarge your community by inviting members of the deaf community. Be an active, engaged member of the community, right? Hearing people can be really funny because you have your own rules that you follow.
The second question is how, as an interpreter, you know, here at NTID, how we can support our younger deaf students to make sure they're engaged.
Well, every deaf student is different. Some of them are going to be assertive, others are going to be shy, right? For many of us, to have an interpreter is a luxury. To have a pretty good interpreter is a greater luxury because some of them may have grown up with unskilled interpreters and they may come from families who don't use sign language. And this may be the first place that they come and they have full access through interpreters, right? They can't criticize it because they're nothing but thankful because they haven't had anything like it to date. So, right, go easy on interpreters. Many students are very forgiving. Share your experiences, right? What you learn in one class, share with the students or your colleagues at, you know, during the next meeting, right? So now some of you are going to realize that you really look weird when you're waiting for the invitation, walking through the cafeteria smiling at us, right? Have those conversations. Be comfortable with disagreeing with what you might be learning in your program, right? Deaf people are not always actively advocating for themselves. They may not have the opportunity or the experience. They may have some fear of what the alternative is. It could be worse if they speak up, right? It could be worse for them next time. And I know that there's more of a demand than the supply of interpreters can meet, and so if they criticize one interpreter, the interpreter who replaces them might not be any better.
In terms of deaf-centered interpreting, I've had these thoughts just like you have over time. And as a CDI, you know, whether we're looking at agencies or places of employment, they oftentimes will assign a hearing person first as an interpreter and then consider hiring a deaf interpreter. You know, like if there's a press conference, you know, I'll have to work with a hearing interpreter that they've assigned me. Now, I'm the one on camera. It's not the hearing interpreter, but the hearing interpreter is supposed to be feeding me. So does this principle apply to when you're working as a deaf interpreter, hearing interpreter team? You know, how do we inform the public that it should be more deaf-centered interpreting?
So I can choose my own.
So that I can choose my own hearing interpreter, one that I'm comfortable with, so that the focus is on me versus the agency thinking about first hiring a hearing interpreter and me being an afterthought.
So my immediate thought is, right, if I ran the zoo, back to that slide, you know? So I think it's that kind of conversation, right? What does my way look like? Is the agency following a deaf-centered model? It seems not. And if they're not, right, then that's not engaging. That's not effective. It's not deaf-centered or deaf-friendly. And so what do we do about that? Right? I think the deaf community needs to challenge the agencies. I think they need to speak up and speak out against that. Maybe it's local to the Rochester community. You might have more knowledge and power than you realize you have, right? The strength and the necessity for a DI, a CDI in those instances gives you a lot of power. So, you know, Deaf Eyes on Interpreting, there is one chapter called Accountability, and it's about assigning interpreters, right? If I'm assigned an interpreter that I'm completely unfamiliar with, I can recall LinguaBee, right? When the request first came out, they had the 5 available interpreters who had created videos of their work, and the deaf person, the presenter, was able to assess the interpreter and request the one of their preference. So maybe we need to have something more like that, right? For whatever it is, a doctor's appointment or an academic presentation, the agencies need to begin to present options to the deaf people so that they can assess the interpreter that they're most comfortable with, right? And then in that particular experience, and maybe we need to begin to have Yelp reviews of interpreters, right? On a 1 to 5 scale, right? So that deaf people have the ability to research an interpreter and see what their Yelp reviews are like. I don't know, maybe that'll work, maybe it won't work, but it's an idea, right? Accountability of interpreters, accountability within the community. I think your community has to work with the agencies who are making these decisions.
It is time to wrap up this session together. I wanted to offer you a gift. This is from Dr. Jerry Buckley and Gary Beam. They wanted me to give you this gift.
Are they here? Are they here in the room?
Unfortunately, they had to leave, so they left the gift with me to give to you. There are 89 people who have viewed this presentation. 91 people on Zoom, 89 in the room. So this was a very successful, well-attended workshop. You're getting some applause from the group here. Yes, absolutely. It's a good time to close our time together. I want to thank Dr. Tom Holcomb for his presentation. I hope you enjoyed what he had to say, and I hope you learned something. Thank you so much for your time today.